In corporate America, loyalty is a hollow word printed on coffee mugs right before they use you as a human shield. My boss assumed I would blindly take the fall when his mistake cost us $85 million. He forgot one fundamental rule. The architect who builds the system knows exactly how to tear it down. If you plan to back me into a corner, make sure I do not hold the black box containing your sins. Hello, wonderful listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your continuous and loyal support over the years. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to operate, which means we are forced to halt all new video uploads here for the foreseeable future and shift our operations entirely to Patreon. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community, where you will hear even better, exclusive true stories with longer runtimes, highly detailed situations that we simply cannot share publicly on YouTube, and multiple emotional voice actors bringing the narratives to life. You can join us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link located in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us dive straight into today's tale of corporate betrayal. Starting with my name, Lucy Morales. I am 32 years old, and until recently, I held the title of Lead Data Architect at Axiom Health Metrics, a highly lucrative private medical analytics firm based in Austin, Texas. If you have ever worked in the tech industry, you know exactly what my days looked like. I was the quiet, invisible engine humming in the background, a person who lived and breathed databases, predictive modeling, and system architecture. I sat in a freezing, dimly lit cubicle while the Texas sun baked the pavement outside, single-handedly carrying roughly 80% of the actual, grueling workload for the entire analytics department. I built the foundational code. I designed the data pipelines. I made sure the servers did not crash when traffic spiked. Yet, in the glossy, glass-walled boardrooms of Axiom, my massive contributions were perpetually eclipsed by a man named Julian Croft. Julian was our vice president of strategy. He was the quintessential modern tech bro, a man who possessed zero actual technical skills, but compensated with custom-tailored suits, $1,000 loafers, and a frightening ability to weaponize meaningless corporate buzzwords. He could not write a single line of Python if his life depended on it, but he could stand in front of the board of directors and weave enchanting fairy tales about paradigm shifts, agile disruption, and dynamic synergy. The executives adored him. He was the golden boy, the charismatic face of the department, while I was just the nameless drone who made his empty promises a reality. For the past year, our entire company had been consumed by the development of Project Sentinel. Sentinel was an incredibly ambitious artificial intelligence algorithm designed to assist emergency room triage for our network of partner hospitals. The scope of the system was strictly limited to adult and senior patients. The concept was straightforward on paper but terrifyingly complex in practice. The software would analyze incoming patients, scanning their vital signs, medical histories, and immediate symptoms to assign them a priority score. In an overcrowded hospital, this algorithm would dictate who received a bed immediately and who had to sit in the waiting room. Because we were dealing with human lives, the margin for error was absolutely zero. However, Julian saw Project Sentinel not as a medical tool, but as a golden ticket. He initiated an extreme, relentless pressure campaign, demanding that we push the software update to the live market 3 months early. The reason was sickeningly simple. He wanted the projected revenue from the early launch to reflect on the third-quarter financial reports. A massive spike in third-quarter profits guaranteed him an exorbitant executive bonus. He did not care about the algorithm. He only cared about his bank account. I fought him tooth and nail. I pushed back in private meetings, and I flooded his inbox with heavily documented emails. I presented raw, undeniable data proving that the artificial intelligence had not undergone sufficient beta testing. I showed him the confusion matrices highlighting a fatal flaw in the neural network. Because the system lacked adequate training data for geriatric nuances, it was completely misinterpreting the symptoms of elderly patients. A healthy 30-year-old with a minor chest ache is entirely different from a 75-year-old with the exact same symptom. My data clearly warned that if we launched now, the system would categorize severe life-threatening cardiac and neurological events in senior citizens as non-emergencies. I stood in his office, begging him to look at the numbers. Julian just adjusted his expensive watch, gave me a patronizing smile, and completely ignored every single warning. He told me I was overthinking it and that we could always patch the bugs in version 2. When I refused to authorize the launch and lock down the deployment pipeline, he did the unthinkable. He bypassed me entirely. Julian utilized his senior executive super administrator privileges to forcefully push the flawed source code directly into the live production environment. As I sat at my desk, watching the horrifying notification flash across my screen, confirming the fatal update had gone live, a direct message from Julian popped up on our internal chat system. It was brief, arrogant, and dripping with disdain. He told me to stop thinking inside the box and blocking innovation. The foundation was laid, the code was out. And I knew with absolute certainty that we had just launched a catastrophic weapon into the emergency rooms of America. Exactly 4 weeks passed after the launch. The disaster did not announce itself with a loud, sudden crash. Instead, it crept into the healthcare network like a silent, invisible plague, tearing through 12 major hospitals across the East Coast. The artificial intelligence began doing exactly what my predictive models had warned it would do. It started systematically and ruthlessly downgrading elderly patients experiencing severe, life-threatening medical emergencies. The algorithm processed their complex, nuanced symptoms and spit out dangerously incorrect triage scores. A 72-year-old man suffering a massive, debilitating stroke was coldly labeled by the system as experiencing a minor tension migraine. An 80-year-old woman in the critical stages of sudden cardiac arrest was categorized as having mild indigestion. Because the machine declared they were fine, the nursing staff had to follow protocol. Thousands of vulnerable stroke and heart attack victims were shunted into the lowest priority queue. They were forced to sit on uncomfortable plastic chairs in freezing, crowded waiting rooms for 4, 5, and sometimes even 6 hours while their golden window for medical survival slammed completely shut. The fallout was immediate, brutal, and entirely catastrophic. It began with a trickle of disturbing local news reports, but within 48 hours, it had exploded into a raging nationwide media firestorm. Every major news network ran headline stories about the killer algorithm. Reporters were standing outside emergency rooms, shoving microphones into the tear-stained faces of grieving families who had lost their loved ones while waiting for a doctor. The public outrage was palpable. A massive tidal wave of fury directed straight at our proprietary technology. Then came the devastating legal hammer. A consortium representing the 12 affected partner hospitals filed a massive class action lawsuit against Axiom Health Metrics. They were seeking $85 million in punitive and compensatory damages. The entire structural foundation of our company shook violently under the weight of the litigation. Investors panicked. Our corporate stocks plummeted into the abyss. And the air inside our headquarters grew thick with undeniable terror. The environment inside the analytics department turned violently toxic almost overnight. Paranoia infected everyone from the interns up to the senior directors. Julian, the man who had confidently and aggressively rammed the deployment through the pipeline, suddenly became a ghost in the office. His heavy oak office door, usually left wide open to showcase his expensive tailored suits and his loud, boastful phone calls, was now permanently locked shut. I watched through the frosted glass panels as he held hushed, frantic meetings with the internal legal team and the upper management executives. I was deliberately and systematically excluded from every single one of those critical crisis management sessions. Yet, whenever a member of the board of directors happened to walk through our floor, Julian would suddenly materialize right by my desk. He would place a heavy, lingering hand on my shoulder and loudly proclaim, "We are all in this together. Lucy," wearing a smile so sickeningly fake and rehearsed that it made my stomach churn with disgust. The real nightmare, however, began on a gloomy Tuesday morning. I arrived at the office early, desperate to analyze the incoming server logs and see if I could write an emergency hotfix to stop the algorithm from causing further harm to patients. I confidently typed my administrative credentials into the core system dashboard, expecting the familiar barrage of engineering controls to populate the screen. Instead, the monitor flashed a stark, bright red error message indicating that my access had been explicitly denied. I tried again, thinking I had made a simple typo. The same angry red message appeared. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. I had built this entire dashboard from the ground up, yet my account had been abruptly downgraded to a basic, read-only user tier. I could not view the active diagnostic streams. I could not deploy emergency safety patches. I was entirely locked out of my own creation. I immediately called the Information Technology Department to demand an explanation, but my support tickets went completely unanswered, and their internal phone lines mysteriously routed me straight to an automated voicemail system. A cold, terrifying sense of dread washed over me, chilling me to the bone. When you work in data architecture for a decade, you learn to trust your paranoid instincts when your digital environment suddenly shifts without warning. I needed to know exactly what was happening behind the corporate curtain. Since the primary graphical dashboard was hopelessly blocked, I bypassed the user interface entirely and opened a raw, unmonitored command terminal. I dug deep into the system backend, accessing the raw Git logs. For those outside of the tech industry, Git logs serve as the immutable historical record of every single change, update, and deployment made to a company's source code. I pulled up the exact digital timestamp from exactly 4 weeks ago, the very moment the fatal Sentinel update was forcefully pushed into the live hospital environment. I scanned the chaotic lines of code, specifically looking for Julian's digital signature and his executive override command. What I saw instead made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. Julian's name was completely gone from the record. In its place, permanently and irrefutably stamped onto the catastrophic deployment approval command, was my own unique user identification. According to the official, heavily doctored company records, I was the sole rogue engineer who had overridden the safety protocols. I was the one who had forced the untested, deadly artificial intelligence into the hospitals without executive permission. The digital paper trail had been expertly manipulated and forged to frame me for the entire disaster. Pure panic seized my throat, choking the air out of my lungs. I was trapped in a meticulously designed, inescapable cage. Julian and the corporate executives were not trying to fix the software disaster at all. They were quietly stripping away my administrative power, severing my internal communications, and isolating me from the rest of the company. I realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that Axiom Health Metrics was silently preparing for a slaughter. They desperately needed a sacrificial lamb to offer to the angry public and the ruthless lawyers, and they had already chosen me to take the ultimate fall for their $85 million bloodbath. The summons came exactly 2 hours after I discovered the forged deployment logs. The shadow of the Human Resources Director suddenly fell across my desk. She did not send a calendar invite or an instant message. She simply appeared, her face a mask of practiced corporate neutrality, and politely asked me to follow her. It felt less like a meeting invitation and more like a prisoner transport. As we reached the heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite, a security guard stepped forward and instructed me to place my smartphone, my digital smartwatch, and even my building keycard into a small metal lockbox. He claimed it was standard company policy for highly confidential legal briefings. I knew better. They were ensuring I could not record a single second of what was about to happen. The conference room was completely devoid of natural light, chilled to a temperature that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Sitting across the long, polished glass table were 2 senior internal corporate attorneys. They were flanked by Julian, who was slouched in a high-backed leather chair, staring at the floor with an expression of profound, perfectly rehearsed sorrow. The lead attorney, a man with cold, unblinking eyes, did not waste a single moment on pleasantries. He slid a thick, bound document across the table. He called it a unified defense scenario. But as he began to speak, the true sickening nature of the document became horrifyingly clear. The lawyer spoke in a calm, calculated monotone, weaving a narrative that completely rewrote history. He suggested that, based on their preliminary internal investigations, the software disaster was the tragic result of a siloed workflow. He utilized careful, loaded phrases like rogue optimization enthusiasm and unauthorized sprint acceleration. He was meticulously painting a picture where I, the brilliant but dangerously arrogant lead architect, had bypassed all executive oversight. According to his fabricated story, I was so blinded by my own technical hubris that I unilaterally pushed the fatal update to the hospitals without ever informing my superiors. He stated that if I signed this narrative agreement, the company would officially terminate me for gross professional negligence, but they would graciously protect me from being personally named in the $85 million class action lawsuit. They were holding a legal gun to my head, offering me the option of either self-sabotaging my professional life or facing total monetary collapse. That was when Julian leaned forward to deliver his performance. He looked me directly in the eyes, his face etched with fake empathy. "We do not blame you, Lucy," Julian said, his voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We know how intense the pressure of the tech industry can be. It can cloud anyone's judgment. You wanted to innovate, you wanted to break boundaries, and you simply moved too fast. Axiom is not going to throw you to the wolves. We have structured a very generous severance package to help you transition to your next chapter. We just need to present a united front to the media and the courts." A fiery, suffocating rage clawed at my throat. I refused to let this man destroy my life to save his executive bonuses. I reached for my company laptop, which they had allowed me to bring into the room, fully intending to blow their fabricated story to pieces. My hands were shaking slightly as I opened the screen and connected to the local network. "I have proof," I stated firmly, my voice echoing in the silent room. "I have direct messages and emails from you, Julian, explicitly ordering me to ignore the safety protocols. You threatened my job if I did not launch early." I opened our internal communication platform, navigating straight to my private chat history with the vice president. My heart completely stopped. The screen was absolutely blank. I frantically clicked on the archived folders. Empty. I opened the company email client and searched for every single thread containing his name over the past 90 days. The server returned 0 results. Every directive, every threat, every warning I had ever sent him had been wiped from existence. A pristine, sterile white screen stared back at me, mocking my desperation. The terrifying reality of my situation crashed down on me like a physical weight. The sudden demotion of my administrative access earlier that morning was not a glitch. The information technology department had not been ignoring my support tickets. Julian had used his ultimate executive authority to order a complete, systematic scrub of the internal servers under the guise of a security audit. He had eradicated the entire digital footprint of his crimes before he ever stepped foot into this conference room. He had effectively disarmed me before the battle even began. If I stood up right now and accused him of a massive corporate cover-up without a single shred of digital evidence to back my claims, I would sound like a hysterical, desperate liar trying to avoid accountability. These ruthless lawyers would devour me alive in a courtroom. The instinct to scream, to flip the heavy glass table, and to curse them all was almost entirely overwhelming. But surviving for a decade in a cutthroat, male-dominated corporate jungle teaches you one vital, life-saving lesson. You never show your opponent your cards when you're holding a losing hand in their territory. I took a deep, trembling breath, forcing the white-hot anger down into the deepest pit of my stomach. I let my shoulders slump forward in a posture of total defeat. I brought a shaking hand up to my face, allowing hot, authentic-looking tears of frustration to spill over my eyelashes and roll down my cheeks. I looked down at my hands, letting out a quiet, pathetic sob. "Okay," I whispered, making my voice crack perfectly. "I understand. Where do I sign?" I watched through my tears as the heavy, oppressive tension immediately left the room. The two lawyers exchanged a brief, triumphant glance, silently congratulating themselves on a swift victory. Julian leaned back into his expensive leather chair, a microscopic, deeply arrogant smirk playing on the corner of his lips. He was completely, utterly convinced that he had just broken me into a million pieces. He had no idea that my surrender was nothing more than the opening move of a war he could never win. The moment the heavy wooden door of my apartment clicked shut, the pathetic, trembling victim routine I had performed in that conference room vanished entirely. I did not collapse onto my couch. I did not cry. My heart rate, which I had artificially spiked by hyperventilating slightly to produce those fake tears, slowed to a calm, steady rhythm. The corporate lawyers and my vice president genuinely believed they had cornered a naive, terrified engineer who would quietly accept her slaughter to avoid a public trial. They underestimated the fundamental paranoia required to survive as a data architect. When your entire career revolves around building fail-safes for catastrophic system crashes, you do not walk through the corporate world without building a fail-safe for yourself. I walked directly into my bedroom and opened the large walk-in closet. I pushed aside a row of heavy winter coats and knelt on the floor, pulling up a loose wooden floorboard hidden beneath a storage box. Beneath it, resting silently in the dark, was a high-capacity, physical network-attached storage server. It was a beautiful piece of hardware, completely air-gapped, meaning it had absolutely zero connection to the external internet or the corporate network of Axiom Health Metrics. For the past 4 years, I had maintained a highly classified, strictly personal insurance policy. Every single night, precisely at 3 o'clock in the morning when the office was completely empty and network traffic was at its lowest, a hidden script I had buried deep within the company mainframe executed a silent command. It cloned every single email, every internal chat log, and every raw code commit from the company servers, encrypting the data and routing it through a secure, untraceable tunnel directly into this physical drive in my closet. Julian thought he could simply instruct the information technology department to wipe my history and erase his sins from existence. He was a fool who fundamentally misunderstood how data works. You cannot kill data if you do not know where all the backups are buried. I carried the heavy server to my dining table, plugged it into an independent power supply, and connected it directly to my personal, heavily encrypted laptop. The screen flickered to life, asking for a 32-character decryption password. I typed it in without hesitation. The progress bar crawled across the screen, and then, like opening a digital vault, the entire unaltered history of Axiom Health Metrics spilled out before me. I worked with surgical precision, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. I did not need to search for long. The pristine, unmanipulated records from 4 weeks ago were sitting right there, frozen in time. I easily extracted the original, unedited server logs. The data clearly showed the exact moment my administrative access was forcefully bypassed. More importantly, I pulled the system authorization keys. The logs proved undeniably that an anonymous super-administrator account was used to override the security protocols and deploy the fatal update. But Julian was sloppy. I traced the digital signature of that anonymous account directly back to the unique media access control address of the physical computer sitting on his polished mahogany desk. Next, I recovered the internal communications. Every single message he thought he had vaporized was fully restored on my screen. I stared at the aggressive, threatening emails demanding I launch the software early to secure his third-quarter bonus. I had him. I had the smoking gun that proved he was the sole architect of the disaster. But as I sat in the dim light of my apartment, staring at his digital footprint, a nagging instinct tugged at the back of my mind. The pieces of the puzzle fit perfectly, but the picture they formed felt suspiciously simple. Julian was greedy, yes, but aggressively deploying untested software to secure a seasonal bonus was an incredibly reckless gamble, even for a man of his arrogance. If the software failed, which it did, his bonus would be annihilated anyway. The risk vastly outweighed the reward, unless, of course, the failure itself was the actual goal. I decided to dig deeper. I bypassed the standard communication folders and initiated a forensic scan of his encrypted outgoing traffic over the past 6 months. It took nearly 2 hours for my personal machine to crack the secondary encryption layers he had attempted to hide behind. When the files finally decrypted, I found a hidden, shadow email directory that Julian had operated outside of the company servers. I began reading through a long, highly confidential email chain between Julian and an offshore, untraceable hedge fund. As I read the words on the screen, the blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. The sheer magnitude of his psychopathy was breathtaking. Julian had not accidentally launched a flawed medical algorithm because he was impatient. He had deliberately and maliciously orchestrated the entire catastrophe. Through a complex web of anonymous shell companies, Julian had engaged in a massive financial maneuver known as short selling. For those unfamiliar with the stock market, short selling is essentially placing a massive, high-stakes bet that a specific company's stock value will plummet. You borrow shares, sell them at the current high price, wait for the company to crash, buy the shares back at a worthless price, and pocket the massive difference. Julian had bet heavily against Axiom Health Metrics. He knew the artificial intelligence was dangerously flawed because I had explicitly warned him it was. He intentionally bypassed the safety protocols and pushed the deadly software into the hospitals because he actively wanted the system to fail on a catastrophic, national scale. He knowingly gambled with the lives of thousands of vulnerable, elderly patients, allowing them to suffer in emergency rooms, all to intentionally trigger a massive corporate scandal, a devastating lawsuit, and a total collapse of the company's stock. While the hospitals sued us for $85 million and the executives panicked, Julian was quietly sitting in his locked office, raking in tens of millions of dollars in illicit profits from the very destruction he had engineered. He was planning to take his massive payout, use me as the convenient scapegoat to avoid criminal liability, and walk away completely unscathed. I sat in the suffocating silence of my apartment, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. The anger I felt was no longer hot or frantic. It was a cold, absolute zero void. I connected a laser printer to my laptop. The rhythmic, mechanical whir of the machine filled the room as it spit out page after page of damning evidence. I printed the unaltered code commits, the restored chat logs, and the horrifying financial exchanges with the offshore hedge fund. I took the digital files and copied them onto 3 separate, military-grade encrypted flash drives. The next morning, I did not go to the office. I drove to a secure banking facility on the outskirts of the city. I paid for a steel safe deposit box in cash, placed 2 of the encrypted drives and a thick binder of the physical documents inside, and locked it tight. I kept the 3rd drive safely tucked inside the inner pocket of my jacket. My weapon of mass destruction was fully armed, loaded, and perfectly secured. All I had to do now was wait for them to drag me into the courtroom, where I would watch Julian Croft smile one last time before I burned his entire world to ashes. The day of the preliminary arbitration hearing arrived with the oppressive, suffocating weight of a looming public execution. The proceedings took place inside a sprawling, wood-paneled conference room at the federal courthouse in downtown Austin, a space that felt significantly more like a freezing mausoleum than a hall of justice. I walked through the heavy double doors and was instantly hit by a blast of aggressive air conditioning that seemed specifically designed to freeze the blood of the accused. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, thick with open hostility. On the left side of the long center aisle sat the formidable legal army representing the 12 affected partner hospitals. Their eyes were fixed on me with undisguised, venomous hatred. To them, I was not a human being or a former employee caught in a corporate crossfire. I was a monster. I was a reckless, arrogant coder who had casually gambled with the lives of thousands of elderly patients. On the right side sat the Axiom Health Metrics corporate defense team, a solid, impenetrable wall of expensive gray suits protecting their golden executives. Julian Croft was the very first individual called to the witness stand, and his performance was nothing short of a terrifying masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. He practically glided to the front of the room, adjusted his impeccably tailored navy blue suit, took the oath with a steady, confident hand, and looked out at the room with an expression of profound, carefully practiced grief. For nearly 45 solid minutes, he spun a devastatingly convincing narrative that completely rewrote the history of the last year. He did not raise his voice or yell. Instead, he spoke with the quiet, measured tone of a deeply disappointed mentor mourning the fall of a promising student. He painted a vivid, agonizing picture of a department severely fractured by what he called my catastrophic weakness in micromanagement and my blinding, toxic personal ambition. "We genuinely tried to rein her in," Julian testified, looking directly at the federal arbitrator, his voice cracking perfectly with artificial emotion. "We practically begged Miss Morales to respect the established beta testing boundaries. We held meetings, we sent warnings, but she was technically brilliant, and unfortunately, that brilliance was completely overshadowed by an arrogant desire to revolutionize the medical technology industry on her own timeline. She operated in the dark, routinely bypassing our executive safety nets. We trusted her to build a system to save lives, but she treated the deployment like a race for personal glory. And the tragic result is what brings us all into this room today." He sounded so incredibly reasonable, so heartbreakingly sincere, that I almost wanted to stand up and applaud his acting skills. Following his flawless testimony, the lead litigator for the plaintiffs took over the floor. He was a tall, imposing man with a booming, theatrical voice that echoed violently off the heavy wooden walls. He paced back and forth, weaponizing Julian's fabricated testimony as heavy artillery to completely obliterate my character. He pointed a long, accusing finger directly at my face, publicly branding me a technological criminal. He graphically and ruthlessly detailed the immense suffering of the heart attack victims and the stroke patients who had languished in freezing hospital waiting rooms. He forcefully attributed every single agonizing minute of their pain and the $85 million in resulting damages directly to my supposed unchecked ego. I was painted as a callous, keyboard-obsessed maniac who viewed human trauma as nothing more than disposable data points on a screen. When the bailiff finally called my name to take the stand, the entire massive room fell into a suffocating, heavy silence. I stood up slowly from my chair, making absolutely sure that my knees visibly trembled. I walked toward the wooden witness box with my shoulders severely hunched, keeping my eyes glued firmly to the carpeted floor. I had spent the last 3 days meticulously perfecting this exact, pathetic persona. I was the terrified, broken, defenseless scapegoat they all desperately expected to see. As I took my seat, I allowed my breathing to become audibly shallow and erratic. I nervously clutched the wooden edges of the podium with shaking fingers. When the plaintiff's attorney began his incredibly aggressive cross-examination, I answered his rapid-fire questions with weak, hesitant stammers. "I do not know," I whispered into the microphone, my voice barely carrying past the first row of seats. I was really just trying to do the job I was assigned. I avoided making eye contact with the arbitrator, the lawyers, and the audience, deliberately projecting the flawless image of a deeply guilty woman collapsing entirely under the crushing weight of her own catastrophic actions. From the corner of my eye, I could clearly observe the Axiom corporate defense table. The team of expensive company lawyers was practically glowing with immense relief. They leaned back comfortably in their plush, oversized leather chairs, casually sipping from their water glasses and exchanging smug, completely victorious glances. Julian was seated right in the absolute center of them, looking utterly and thoroughly relaxed. He casually crossed his legs, resting one hand loosely on the mahogany table, a tiny, deeply arrogant smirk playing constantly on the corner of his lips. He was entirely convinced that the steel trap had finally snapped shut on my neck. They all genuinely believed they had successfully nailed the very last plank into the coffin burying my career, my reputation, and my freedom. They were completely at ease, eagerly waiting for the final procedural blow that would abruptly end the hearing and formalize my total destruction. The pacing in the room grew as tight and strained as a pulled wire. The lead plaintiff attorney stepped right up to the edge of the witness box, aggressively invading my personal space to deliver the final, crushing strike. He adjusted his silver glasses, looking down at me with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "Ms. Morales," his voice boomed, dripping with unyielding contempt. "You sit here today and attempt to play the fragile victim, but the digital logs clearly show your authorization codes. The executive testimonies clearly outline your gross insubordination. So, I will ask you one final, simple question for the official legal record. Do you have any evidence, absolutely anything at all, no matter how small, to show that you did not independently sabotage this system?" The trembling in my hands ceased instantly. The pathetic, frightened slump in my shoulders evaporated as I straightened my spine. Sitting up completely tall in the witness chair, I lifted my head, and the carefully manufactured tears dried up. I locked eyes directly with the lead plaintiff litigator. The mask of the terrified scapegoat was completely gone, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp composure that made the attorney physically take a half-step backward. "Yes," I stated, my voice no longer a fragile whisper, but a clear, commanding strike that echoed sharply across the cavernous room. "I absolutely do." I reached down into my leather briefcase resting by my feet. I pulled out a massively thick, perfectly organized binder and a heavy-duty, military-grade encrypted flash drive. I turned my attention directly to the federal arbitrator sitting behind the elevated bench. "Your Honor," I addressed him firmly, "I officially request to submit new, critical physical and digital evidence into the official court record. This drive contains the unedited, original source code logs, direct internal communications, and network access records that completely contradict the fabricated narrative presented today." Before the Axiom defense team could even process what was happening, I plugged the drive into the witness podium terminal. The massive projector screen behind me flared to life. I did not give anyone a chance to breathe. I immediately pulled up the pristine, unaltered access logs I had saved from my closet server. "If you look at the screen," I announced, projecting my voice so every single person in the gallery could hear, "you will see the exact digital timestamp of the fatal system deployment. You will also see that the super administrator account used to force the launch does not belong to me. It is directly tied to the internal protocol address and the unique machine identification number of the desktop computer located inside the locked private office of Julian Croft." A loud collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. I clicked the next file, pulling up the restored communication platform history. "Furthermore," I continued relentlessly, "here is the direct message Julian Croft sent to my personal workstation exactly 2 minutes after he bypassed my security lock, ordering me to," and I quote, "stop thinking inside the box and blocking innovation." Chaos erupted at the Axiom corporate defense table. The lead company lawyer shot up from his chair, his face turning an angry, blotchy red. "Objection!" he screamed, waving his hands frantically. "This is unauthorized, illegally obtained proprietary data. She hacked our systems. This evidence is completely inadmissible." I did not even flinch. I turned back to the microphone, delivering my second, fatal blow with absolute, merciless precision. "They can argue the admissibility of the server logs all they want," I fired back, my voice slicing through the attorney's screaming. "But they cannot object to federal financial crimes, because this is no longer a simple civil dispute over corporate negligence. This is a premeditated, massive criminal fraud operation." With a final keystroke, I replaced the server logs on the massive screen with the decrypted, highly confidential emails between Julian and his offshore hedge fund. I displayed the horrifying, undeniable records of the anonymous shell companies and the massive short-selling financial transactions. "Julian Croft did not accidentally launch a flawed algorithm," I declared, staring directly at the pale, sweating face of my former boss. "He intentionally orchestrated the failure. He deliberately bypassed the safety protocols because he had heavily shorted millions of shares of his own company stock. He knowingly weaponized a medical application and gambled with the lives of thousands of elderly patients to deliberately crash Axiom Health metrics and personally pocket tens of millions of dollars in illicit trading profits. A heavy, suffocating, Dead silence slammed down on the entire courtroom, the kind of absolute silence that rings in your ears. The Axiom lead attorney, who had been screaming a second ago, froze completely in his tracks. He stared at the colossal financial transaction records projected on the wall. He was a ruthless corporate lawyer, but he was not an idiot. He knew instantly that defending a negligent executive was a lucrative job, but participating in a massive federal securities fraud cover-up would strip him of his legal license and land him in a federal penitentiary. Without speaking a single word, the lead attorney slowly sat back down. He looked at his legal team and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The entire wall of expensive gray suits immediately began violently shuffling their papers, aggressively snapping their briefcases shut. They physically backed their chairs away from Julian. "Your Honor," the lead attorney stammered, his voice completely devoid of its former arrogance. "In light of this entirely new and deeply disturbing information, our firm must immediately and formally withdraw our legal representation for Mr. Croft. We cannot and will not represent a client engaged in active federal fraud." Julian Croft was entirely destroyed. He did not yell. He did not try to defend himself. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, terrifying shade of white. His jaw dropped silently, and he literally collapsed backward into his heavy leather chair, a broken, empty shell of a man who suddenly realized he was going to spend the rest of his natural life behind thick iron bars. The aftermath was swift and absolute. The federal authorities intervened before the arbitration hearing even formally adjourned. Julian was escorted out of the building in heavy steel handcuffs. He was eventually convicted on multiple counts of severe securities fraud, reckless endangerment, and massive corporate sabotage, earning himself a 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal prison. The Axiom board of directors was entirely gutted, and the company was forcibly liquidated to pay the $85 million settlement to the affected hospitals. As for me, I am currently sitting in a beautiful, sunlit glass corner office overlooking the beautiful skyline of Austin, Texas. I used my pristine professional reputation to found my own highly successful, elite technological data auditing firm. The coffee I'm drinking right now tastes incredibly sweet. Just a few moments ago, my receptionist transferred a desperate, frantic phone call from two of the former Axiom executives who are currently facing their own massive legal battles and desperately want to hire me to save their remaining assets. I listened to them beg for exactly 30 seconds. Then, with a bright, genuine smile on my face, I pressed the red button and hung up the phone. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are listening from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story satisfying and want to hear more, please remember that YouTube has completely shut down our monetization, and we will no longer be uploading new videos here in the near future. We are moving everything over to Patreon. Please help us keep this channel alive by joining our Patreon community, where you will get access to the absolute best, most exclusive true stories that are far too intense to publish on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the square graphic code on your screen right now, or simply click the link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again, and I will see you all on the other side.